Welcome to Interwoven, a podcast where we follow the winding threads of literature as they weave together stories and voices across time and cultures. Hi everyone, welcome back to Interwoven. I'm your host Azka Rahman, and today we're going to be discussing comparative literature and history and how the humanities can be seen beyond Western standards and canons of narratives. I'm joined by Eliza Kaminska-Benadat, who's a second-year undergraduate studying history at Oxford. And I'm also joined by an Ertegun Scholar here at Oxford, Faisal Javid, who's studying a master's in comparative literature. I'm really happy to have you guys here. How are you doing?
Very happy to be here.
Glad.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. Yeah, it's great. Good to be here.
Oh, I'm glad. But yeah, I guess we'll just dive right into why it is that we even decided to come here together today to talk about studying the humanities beyond sort of Western standards, beyond Western categories. And yeah, so why do you think that there's value in that?
I mean, this term I'm looking at empire in the Middle East, and I think the very first lecture kind of started of saying how the Middle East is a made-up category and it does fluctuate over time, and it's not like a static way of analysing the region. And I think that kind of shows how moving beyond the Western canon allows complexities of different areas outside of the Western sphere to be truly analysed and looked at in terms of things that came from within rather than looking from the outside perspective. I think the Western canon sort of sets out ideas of how, for example, nationalism or imperialism looked like. But when you start looking from, for example, Egypt or Algeria in terms of colonialism, you see that it wasn't as straightforward. And I think that's the valuable part, to kind of understand these regions as their own value rather than just adding into the imperial and Western canon.
Yeah, from a literary perspective, I think what you said about looking from within a certain area is valuable, because I think that that's what topics surrounding postcolonial literature aim to do. It's to look at voices that have remained written about instead of written from, almost.
Yeah, definitely, totally agree with you guys. I think it's completely necessary to look at literature other than what the Western literature looks like or what the Western world looks at. Even if you deep dive into these categories themselves are very problematic. Even if you talk about post-colonial literature, Western literature, Eastern literature, or Orientalism or anything like that, these terms themselves contest various ideas, and then it also lets us understand why do we need these terms in the very first place, and how did these terms come into, and why do people use them, which is very important to look at just to understand how world works or how literature in the world works. And I think that is where the idea of world literature came into. And even though it was Goethe, he was hey, the connection and the disconnection of the national literature is over. It is now more about world literature, literature beyond nationalities. It is about the people who write outside their original identities. So that's where the world literature began, where we look at different kind of authors, writers who write beyond their own nationalities. And it has something to do with the literature which moves beyond a national boundary, in a sense. For example, if something was written back in India, it's not now just there. It has traveled across different countries, nations, where different people look at the same things. And the empire definitely has been there in the world. Even if you look at the history, there's a long colonial history of the empire, especially the British Empire. And the thing with these empires is they just do not leave their marks on the psyche of people, or what you call collective unconscious or something else. It also leaves something with their language. For example, if if a British Empire was somewhere, so it also left their own language in it. And that's where writers also decide, why don't we use the language that was given to us by these colonial masters at some point? We can even use these tools against them in a way where we reflect upon our own identities or whatever happened with all of us. But at the same time, it also leaves the burden of language and burden of translation on the people who were colonized. Like even if you look at Latin America, there are so many different nations who were colonized by Spaniards, and they were like, you have to learn the language of us, not the other way around. So there are these so many burdens which come with the languages, with the empire, or with the literature that comes around, and it's definitely necessary to look at a comparative angle where you try to understand these things from various angles so that you have a nuanced understanding of the understanding itself is distant and close. So, yeah.
I really liked what you said about how categories themselves are problematic and how that then interplays with the burden of language, because even something like Orientalism has received certain sort of levels of backlash, and comparative literature, at least the little bit that I'm interested in, is also looking at how that divide across time and space is being handled, and I think that that's one of the ways through which those categories can sometimes become really slippery. So I've been interested in looking at the influence of 14th century Sufi Persian poets on American writers in the 18th century. And what's taking place there is almost more of a conversation where one culture or tradition speaks back to another. And that idea of conversation, of both reception but then also the past speaking to you, is something that's really valuable. And when it comes to categories like postcolonial literature, you only see one side of it. It feels like less of a conversation and more of a process of boxing sort of views or people into things that can be handled academically. Like we need certain phrases or terminology to actually handle discussions about new genres and new approaches that are being formed. But I guess a historical perspective would be interesting to consider.
I mean, I think I definitely agree with the idea of the problem of having a post-colonial label, but as you mentioned, Latin America and the Spaniards, that kind of made me think of the fact that they had such a vibrant, not necessarily literature because they were pre-literate societies in a way, but there was such a vibrant sort of the Mexica, the Aztec, the Inca. They had their own ways of recording information and passing on stories, and sometimes the post-colonial label pushes away from that, and I think sometimes there has to be value looked at how were these societies before these imperialism came about. And I think especially the Mexica, they were so advanced scientifically, and so were the Maya, and you have pictographic, I think, evidence, that's the correct term, and you see how they were able to pass on so many complex things and identities, and how they had categorization within the society and how they were structured without sort of literate methods. So yeah.
I think orality is really cool because that's something that isn't contained within written words, and I feel like from some of the literature I've read, some writers like Achebe in Things Fall Apart, he looks back to folklore and folk traditions, and I guess it's that idea of trying to capture not only written works but voice, which goes back to conversation. There's something almost more intangible about that kind of interaction. And
yeah, definitely. It made me remind of the Chinua Achebe. So it made me remind of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness and how he represents the Congo people in there. And if you look at Achebe's writings as well, in one of his critical essays, which talks about Heart of Darkness, he mentions something around that. So on the other side of the river Congo, there was these categories of people who were called Fang people. And they made such beautiful pottery that so many great artists in that particular time praised their artistry. But he says something like that Conrad was too blind to see all of these things, where he tried to portray an image of that how how as a colonizer, when they go into that place, that he makes them seem like that these are the people who make you degraded and downgraded when you live with those, which is very problematic way of seeing things. It's almost being blind to the other side of things. And even if you start questioning that, we try to assume why did they even go there in the first place? That is the question itself. And other than that, I personally believe that is where this literature comes along, especially literature written in English. Like, Achebe decided to appropriate English language, even though one of his contemporaries back in his own nation, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, he talked about the abolition of English department, and he even stopped writing in English, where he started writing in Gikuyu language, and he was like, we need to write in our own language. So these parameters where we look at someone abrogating the language and someone appropriating the language itself becomes a way of seeing things differently and contesting what happened in the history. And at the same time, I also feel like when we talk about postcolonial writers, it also sometimes takes the label to them and makes us look like as if the nation who have gone through imperialism, colonialism, they are still struggling with the colonialism, as if they have nothing else to write about. And all their writings are all about this. But then there are some people who argue that we should actually just avoid the colonizers themselves. We don't need to focus on them. One way of anti-colonial struggle is just ignoring the colonizer, like maybe not writing more about them, not having your themes or writings cross across that.
Yeah, I think that I see that sometimes when I'm reading books by someone like Jhumpa Lahiri, an interpreter of melodies. You sometimes have like the category of the third culture kid who's bound to struggle because they're straddling these multiple cultures. And I feel like over time it's almost becoming a critical cliche. From my own experiences living in the Middle East, where I've had friends from all over the world and from multiple different backgrounds, and many of them were third culture kids, we all kind of once had this conversation about it sometimes being almost overdone in certain books. And especially in scholarship that's then interested in it. So the debate also comes down to whether scholarship and structures are then imposed to make the sort of idea of post-colonialness almost more explicit than it needs to be. And yeah, in terms of Heart of Darkness, I read Tayyib Saleh's Season of Migration to the North last year, which was a rewriting of Heart of Darkness. And it was really interesting because he kind of inverts all of the structures that you see in Heart of Darkness. So it's about this man in Sudan who goes to Britain and pursues further education. But then you kind of see him psychologically and emotionally going downhill. But I think it's interesting because there's this moment in the book that I really liked, and it was this description of his library as being full of white authors and white ideas, and it was described as like a graveyard or a mausoleum, which I thought was really interesting in terms of how it's sort of a sign of the slow creeping away of his roots in Sudan. But then he also complexifies that idea of like, oh, I've moved away from my homeland, and so I'm bound to be disconnected from it, because I feel like even in Heart of Darkness you have this entire debate about whether Kurtz was actually endorsing colonial views or not, because he also ends up going mad, and his reason for madness, it's not clear whether it was caused by his time spent there or whether it was caused by the colonial mission itself. And Tayyib Saleh like inverts that too. Is it like movement away from your homeland that's causing this, or not, or is there something deeper? So yeah, and that was also written in English, which I find interesting as well. But then you also have writers like Derek Walcott, who says that he enjoys writing in English, and I feel like that then again evades that sort of expectation of recovering pasts through writing in your own language. But yeah, that's my thoughts. And
I mean, I'm nowhere near as well read as either of you guys, but the idea of using English, or like the language of the colonizer, because it like could not necessarily could have been English, could have been like French, which is like obviously a very big pro-enterprise. I think, in a way, it gives the writers agency. I mean, most of my reading of like colonial and post-colonial is kind of rooted in memoirs and like non-fiction rather than fiction. And I think sometimes the way the language is used, obviously, is a way of going against the sort of norm and the standards and how they use a foreign language to describe their experiences. And I think, in a way, to kind of link what was said previously about like Orientalism, I think we were looking at this text for my course, and it's written one by an Egyptian who goes to Paris to learn about like the French infrastructure and to bring it back into Egypt to implement it, to like modernise the state, and then one from a Moroccan consul that goes as like part of a bigger party to kind of for diplomatic reasons to Paris to meet the king at a time when Morocco kind of solidified its relationship with France in kind of a positive way at a time when Algeria was being basically colonised by the French. So I think those two texts show kind of the reversal of Orientalism, where you have the Muslim men and how they perceive like French society, and it's quite interesting to see how they have this inner conflict and how they phrase it in terms of I'm a Muslim and I know that like Islam is the final revelation of God and how we like should follow this because this is like the right way, and how they can come in conflict with Western ideals and how that kind of not makes them struggle with their identity, but it's more the way they just understand it because they try to kind of phrase in a way that's compatible to their own schemas and the way they use words and language. And for example, in Takhtawi, he's like the Egyptian and he focuses a lot on the actual infrastructure and how the government and like the constitution of France. And there's a lot of sections where he equates French positions to Egyptian ones with disclaimers saying it's like this position but slightly different. And I think that's really interesting to see how it's almost like Orientalism in reverse. We have an insight of what the colonised or the sort of inferior group of people, as perceived by the colonial enterprise, not necessarily actually inferior, grapple with meeting new ideas. And I thought that it's like this funny like way of Orientalism, because if you actually read, there's so many ways where these two like people say how they couldn't understand this or they can't believe this is this. And Al-Safar, like the Moroccan that goes to Paris, he says, I listened to this music and I felt it was so bland that I didn't even want to clap. And it's just, it's one of those nuances of culture and how they understand all these sort of non-political structures that are really interesting, I think.
I found that last bit funny. I think it reminded me of one of the medieval travel accounts I read by one of the Arab travellers. I've forgotten his name, but he goes to like Scandinavia, and like the first sentence of one of his paragraphs, it's just like, this land is so dirty, I don't know how they live in it. And I just thought that was like, it's just a flat rejection of Western ideals to the point where it's actually really funny how blunt it sometimes can be. On this same track, Zora Neale Hurston, I read her autobiography last year, Dust Tracks on a Road. She was writing during the same time as Dubois, who wrote about double consciousness, which was this idea that when, as he based it off of his own experiences, so as a black man, when he sees himself as both possessing a consciousness that he can perceive from within, but then he also sees the sort of things that are imputed to him and what's enforced upon him. But then Zora Neale Hurston, writing at the same time, in her book she begins by saying, I'm not joining the sobbing school of, I've got a split identity, I'm just not doing that. She writes that in one of her other essays too, how it feels to be coloured me. And I mean, her autobiography at times is humorous too, because she continuously says, I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking that I'm going to reach and start talking about like one of the racist experiences I've faced in Columbia University, but guess what? I haven't had any, and I'm not going to talk about them regardless of whether they happen. And I guess that confidence is also interesting, because she then says that this idea of a split identity, of a split consciousness, is something that critics almost bring into existence themselves, and it's not always sort of reflective of what's happening. That's like similar to how the Moroccan traveller is inverting Orientalism, she's inverting double consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, if when you talk about Du Bois' double consciousness and how his own experiences reflected in his own writings, it was definitely very hard for back then for them, even though there was an American Revolution, but still the idea and the problems that were caused by that racism were still inherent in the people. And the thing about these things is people are conditioned in such a way that the ideals that have been formed, even though conventionally or through constitutions these things are banned, but the elements of them still remain because it's embedded in their own identities. And that is what something Du Bois himself struggled with. And he was like, how do I identify myself as an American and as a Black American at the same time? How do I distinguish these different identities and how so the thing is, he always had to prove himself to be American at the same time and to have his African identity as well, which is very problematic for people to accept because these are two different things that always tussle with each other. And then he thought about, okay, we should probably combine them and emerge throughout of those by learning different things. And I think that's also the same with different languages and different cultures when we see them. Today's world is so globalized that there isn't something, one particular culture or one particular nation. These boundaries have been crossed. And that's where comparative literature also crossed these boundaries, crossed these borders. And even though it has crossed the borders, but it is probably still yet to erase them. And it also made me think about the rewriting of The Tempest by Amy Cesare, where he sees Caliban as a figure who was suppressed by Prospero in the island, and he asserts his own identity. So these rewritings are definitely necessary to look at how things could have been while they are written in a very particular way. And it also made me think about how we are very less known about. There is someone called Ibn Rushd, if you know. His Latinized name is Averroes. He is considered to be one of the first persons who translated Aristotle in Arabic. It is very less talked about because one of the writers called G.R. Malik in his essays talks about that how the translations of Ibn Rushd were actually responsible for the European Renaissance, where they talked about rebirth of these works. Again, they started reading them again. And we know about these critical writers or these philosophers because there have been translations. So these things are very less talked about. And while you were talking about Middle East, it also made me think about Middle East to whom?
Yeah.
So these categories are really difficult to traverse and to think about them because they pose all of these questions. And I think in a way comparative literature helps us in understanding all these things because it makes you some sort of a global critic where you look at all of those things. While at the same time, the problem with the comparative literature is you do not have a canon of theories or texts which you're like, these are the things that I'm looking at and I'm going to look at everything through these categories. So sometimes it also makes you like a nomad where you struggle with, you don't have these categories. That's good, but at the same time, it also makes it difficult. Maybe you would be totally avoided in a way because you do not belong to any particular thing. So, yeah.
What you said about inheriting a tradition and then undoing it, I feel like from my own reading, that idea of uncovering influences that were not considered before is really powerful because it, again, comes back to the art of literary criticism as a sort of unveiling of what's been forgotten. And I think history functions in a really similar way. Someone like Hafiz is often forgotten about. He influenced Ralph Waldo Emerson, who is a transcendentalist, and transcendentalism was basically like the American equivalent of Romanticism. And he influenced a lot of Emerson's ideas about self-reliance, about how sometimes it's best to break away from orthodox or institutionalized forms of religious authority and to look from within yourself. And I mean, Hafiz is mentioned as many times as Wordsworth and Aristotle in all of Emerson's corpus of works, which I think is pretty significant, and yet it's been overlooked for a really long time. Even a text like the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, I feel like that's one of the ones that has received a lot more critical attention more recently. But one of my favourite facts about it is the fact that fragments of his poetry were found in the pockets of World War I soldiers, which I thought was so powerful. I just found that so, interesting because you'd expect them to almost have a, I guess, more nationalistic poem with them, and yet they've got the
poetry with them.
They've got the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam with them instead, which is really interesting. And again, I feel like those voices, those moments of connection across time and cultures is what makes comparative literature and retracing the past really, really powerful.
I mean, I think bringing up the idea of like looking for what's kind of not there in a way and retracing the past, there's like a movement in history, Alltagsgeschichte, or everyday history in English, and it's the idea of questioning why some material things or just like things in textual sources are there when you'd think they shouldn't be there. So it's kind of retracing like kind of like the poetry in the soldier's pockets, like why was it there, and you kind of spearhead into like a bigger like inquiry kind of investigation. But also it's the idea of like reading against the grain. So I think now that I sort of look like at these sort of, like memoirs and like non-fictional writing about experiences during like the colonial times, that the focus was on women, but actually there's like this body of work talking about how the works on women have as much to say about like women and femininity as they do about masculinity. And I think that's kind of, in history at least, seems to be a really recurring theme in terms of imperial and post-colonial history, where gender is such a defining axis of like relations, especially like on a smaller scale like a household, but also how it transplants into the bigger scale. And I think a lot of the time people think that gender history is kind of equivalent to women's history, but actually the second wave of like feminists in historians were trying to get people to understand that you have to look at how men and women, like masculine and feminine, interacted and how one defined the other, and how, for example, in the context of like Egypt in late 19th century, early 20th century, like there was a movement for nationalist movements against the British, and how a lot of the writing will say if we improve the status of women, we're modernising as a nation. And these like, historians go into question, what does it mean? What does it say that if we only have to improve the status of women to modernise? What does that say about men? Sometimes that dimension's lost, and I think like secondary work in history tries to get you to, in a way, compare these two things, where you're not just looking at one, but like more broader. Obviously, it's not in the same nature as like comparative literature. We have like kind of like two texts or two authors and looking at themes, but it's, I think, a similar idea that kind of feeds into that.
Yeah, I feel like so far we've been discussing retracing threads in the past and seeing them in a new light. But I was wondering what you guys think about silence that's almost purposeful. Is there something that in literature, comparative literature, history, where silence is meant to be something that is almost given space, where you sometimes appreciate the fact that maybe there is this blank space and it isn't meant to be filled?
I recently read like this memoir of this Algerian woman called Fatma Amrouche, and she lives in a village, and she's born illegitimate because her father does not recognise her, and she's essentially moved from first like a French-run convent to then a French-run school for orphans because her mum thinks that she's so much of a pariah in society because of her legitimacy that maybe being in these environments is better for her. And the first chapter of her memoir is basically her kind of adolescence until marriage, because she gets married at 16. And in there you see, she describes her life kind of chronologically. She goes, my mother was from here, she gave birth to me, like, and stuff like that. And this was happening at the end of the 19th century, where the French were present in Algeria like quite strongly, and they were their empire was expanding. However, she kind of, apart from the fact that she went to a French convent and a French orphanage, doesn't actually sort of talk about the French Empire, and it's kind of like you said, like a way, like quiet, because you'd think that she would like situate herself within the imperial enterprise, but actually she just talks of her experience as sort of the fact that she kind of feels like she doesn't belong to any religion, like she's neither Christian nor Muslim, because she calls Islam her mother's religion, but then she also doesn't attend church. So she's like looking into society because of the religion and her legitimacy, and as a woman as well, where it was a time when women's positions were changing, but the transformation stage meant it was kind of a bit of a in between. And I think the lack of mention of direct mention of empire and how it affected her allows you to kind of take her life more seriously, because I think maybe it would be a big temptation to just look at how this French imperial law affected her and this and that, but she situates herself sort of as a person, not even as a woman foremost, I'd say, but like the other axis of her identity is sort of secondary.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of Zora Neale Hurston as well, then the idea of you purposefully and consciously blocking off certain expectations that other audiences may find. But from my personal experiences of reading, Bob Kaufman is an African-American poet whose works have largely been lost, and a lot of his works have gone out of publishing, which is really sad. But he took a 10-year-long vow of silence, which he didn't break until 1963 or 1973, somewhere there. And he stopped writing completely and even like verbally communicating with his wife. And that was really intense. And he broke it with a T.S. Eliot poem, I believe, which was kind of crazy. But that silence, I think, is so powerful. And from the reading I've done, a lot of critics say that silence is like a political act, because a lot of his poetry was about jazz and was about music. And then he takes this 10-year-long vow of silence, and so many people, and I agree with this view, I feel like it is this idea of refusing to write in certain conditions as an African-American man, and a lot of critics have linked his silence to the beat movement that was thriving at the time in America, and how jazz specifically was being romanticized and exoticized by a lot of white male writers. And so his silence is not erasure, it's like a political act of refusal and even preservation, which I think is really interesting. And I feel like in those certain moments, silence is powerful. It's meant to be given space, and I feel like those moments kind of reminded me of how, as a literary student or critic, you're almost meant to sort of respect moments where even the writer or the subject of study is almost resisting. And I feel like that in itself is a beautiful moment where you let silence speak for itself. And yeah, Faisal, do you have any?
It's such a very great way of seeing and looking at silence and trying to understand it. It made me remind and think about how sometimes writers and poets talk about silence. Even though silence is something meant to be like a void, there's nothing, but it is as if the silence itself is speaking. And even in a way of writing, and maybe writing poetry or fiction, you could sometimes see the silence coming through in a way, and where it takes different forms and different shapes. It made me remind of one of the writers, one of the poets of Kashmir, Rahman Rahi. When you look at his poetry or read his poetry, it is filled with so many allusions, so many metaphors, and sometimes he tries to talk about certain things which probably would not be easy for him to talk about. But by using these different techniques, literary techniques, he is able to fill that silence where it's necessary to talk about all of those things. But maybe sometimes for some authors, some poets, because of like political repression or maybe some other reasons, they cannot openly talk about some things or write explicitly about those things. And that is where the silence itself speaks. You could feel the repression, you could feel the way these writers write, as if they are writing from a point of view where as if they are half choked, while at the same time they are trying to portray their messages out there that this is something you need to look at. And I think with the silences itself, we need to understand, if we think about different cultures and different nations, the silence could mean something different for all these different people. Look, it just reminded me of, I was reading the story, Heart Lamp. It's from the book which
I've heard of it. I've heard a lot about it, but I haven't had the chance to read it yet.
Yeah, it received a literary award very recently. I mean, I think last year, right? Yeah. There's this one story which is titled as Heart Lamp, where there's this lady who is going through the problems of the marriage back in India. And while we would probably think about the world has moved on and there's so much technological advancement, but there are still cultures, there are still people who are actually going through the same things that maybe in a culture people in like 10 centuries before or like 100 years before people were having these problems. But there are people who go through these problems. This woman in the short story, she tries to like burn herself alive because she is married to this person who is invested in some other woman who is a nurse. She has all these 3-4 kids while she wanted to continue her education and do this examination, but her family is like, no, you have to marry. And when she's married, her examination is just like 3 or 4 months away, and she begs her parents to let her study, but she's not. And when she's married and she has these kids and she goes back to her family and tells them about her problems, that this is what I'm facing. I told you that I needed to be independent to do something for myself, but you did not agree. But while I'm trying to actively seek support from you, you are avoiding me and you are telling me that I am ruining your family image. This idea of family image, or the idea of the joint families themselves, is a problem in certain cultures where if you are a person who wants to achieve something or do something, it's not just about you, it's not just about your immediate family. Your family is this whole, so many people, relatives and everything. So these silences that we see within these cultures, within the nations, reflected by certain authors, certain writers, it doesn't have to be like that the world has moved on. These silences could be still the same, where women in particular are still struggling with the same things that maybe women in Western world have already crossed. So it's a very interesting way of seeing at these things.
What you said about joint family systems, I feel like even from a sort of more, I guess, meta way, one of the things I wanted to discuss was how the humanities are sometimes perceived in a negative light, especially in places like South Asia. I think just more generally as well, it's sometimes seen as something that is often shunned and is rejected. And I mean, Eliza and I were discussing this earlier about how school systems are also sometimes complicit in this, and how math and science are taught as skills, but literature is never taught as a skill. Every year you're just given a text and you're meant to analyze it in the same way. It's not seen or it's not taught as a skill that's valuable. It's just taught as like something you have to do to get through the education systems. And I think that interplays with ideas of how public appearance of the humanities and of literature is both then seeping into stories that we see today, like the one you mentioned. And yeah, Lisa, do you want to?
I mean, talking about the idea of the education system having a role in how humanities are perceived is like very important, because I think, like you said, the idea of humanities being like content, whereas like STEM being like a skill, I think is like a really important thing to highlight, because I think if you ask people from like our schools, like respective schools, they would say, when you ask them like what is English literature, they'd start naming like Shakespeare plays or like Jekyll and Hyde, Christmas Carol. Whereas if you have like maths, they would start saying like, oh, you need like multiplication and like problem solving, and like that's how I think maths is like highlighted as like problem solving. Whereas the progression like from my perspective of history has been, because I kind of like been in the journey for so long, whereas like so many people cut it short when like they don't have to do it anymore. I've seen it progress from sort of being fed content to being made to think a little bit about it, and how maybe like would have gone different to kind of being shown more and more individuals and like schools of thought. And now as a like doing a degree at Oxford, so it's as much about content as about learning about what people wrote about it and how you have to deconstruct what they said. And like that analysis skill is so applicable elsewhere. And even though I don't study like literature, I think now as I'm reading for sort of as a, like for fun, looking at the way some authors like world build or like present certain things, and I'm just like honestly like breaking down, saying like this is just so unbelievable, because the way like they've just got like a gap here or a gap there. And I think that's a really important way that humanities prime you to think. they make you question the information you're being told, and I think that's also being reflected in like the current state of society now. There's so many like news out there, and so many people don't know that you can like fact check this so easy on the internet, but which has never been there before. But they don't do that, and I think that's a reflection of the lack of skills in humanities and how it's seen as content, so it's like less valuable because it's less applicable. Whereas if this deconstructs the skills you're using, it's essentially equivalent to STEM, because you do have the idea of like problem solving where you're given like a perspective, like this critic might be saying this, and you're supposed to be like, well, they're using this evidence, but what about this other evidence or this other theory? And you kind of solve the issue of this being the right answer in a way.
It made me remember about the Dead Boy Society movie.
It's a really good movie.
Yeah, it's a very, really good movie, where one of the dialogues is something like, we don't read or write poetry because it's cute. And it's funny to think about, like, all of these people who navigate around these ideas of, who look at humanities, especially literature, in a very different way when they look at the STEM subjects. Because all of us, as children, we heard stories from our parents, or some people have like bedtime stories. So in a way, the stories, the literature is actually doing the process and informing the minds of the children from the very first place. So we don't think about literature in terms of that way. I like the idea of, you said, literature as skill. So you start with reading, you start with listening, all of these stories which form the canvas of the whole literature. It doesn't have to be like you have to read Shakespeare or you have to read all these big writers just to call yourself a student of literature. It doesn't have to be like that. Even if you like, when you're looking at history, there are historical incidents captured in literature itself, whether it's memoirs or whether it's different novels. So the idea of seeing a difference between STEM subjects and humanities subjects is problematic, and it shouldn't be even there. We shouldn't even be thinking about it, because as important as the STEM subjects are, humanities subjects are equally important as well. They just help you, like the stories help you navigate through your life circumstances, or they help you critically think about things. You don't take everything at face value. Like when you read George Orwell, or when you read all these different people who talked about certain things, and then your perspective changes. And it helps you understand deeper and why are being things castigated in a very particular way, which is important for making a healthy society. So yeah, I think we should be moving ahead of all of these distinctions and divisions.
Yeah, I agree, because I feel like literature also teaches empathy from like day one, basically. And from my own experiences, I read Martyr by Kaveh Akbar last year, and it was such a good book, and it kind of has changed my view of a lot of things, because it shows you how martyrdom is not something that's done on the battlefield. It's something that's done at all stages of life. I think it extrapolated that idea away from a specific context, and it allowed me to see it everywhere, and that's when it became really powerful. And I feel like in STEM, where a lot of things rest on objectivity and on sort of reaching one objective conclusion about something, I think literature then creates the space for you to see the world, but then to also see yourself through a different lens or through a different perspective.
Even different scientific methods or scientific experiments are usually based on imagination, because these scientists have to think about things and then try to search around solutions. And even if you look at literature, there have been so many writers and authors who wrote about things, and because they wrote that fictional thing, scientists just worked on that. Let's see if this is possible. So in a way, there is not a divide between literature and science as much as we see. So maybe we need to take a look at the history and take a look at the incidents, how certain discoveries were done.
Even like biological perspectives are now being applied to literary works. I just wrote an essay on perceptions of conversion, religious conversion from Islam to Christianity during the later Middle Ages and how that's represented. And in current scholarship, there's a lot more interest in sort of physiology and how the convert's sort of physical body is being represented in different ways. And they're now more interested in the medical humanities as a framework through which that can be approached. So science is, I agree, I feel like science is as valuable a framework as literature can be to science.
What you both just said kind of made me think of the person of Ibn Sina, because he was so many things at once. He was writing philosophy, he was writing medical books that were so influential until I think the 15 or 16 or maybe even 1700s, which were then replaced by more updated versions. And he was also writing about legal issues, and he was also into fictional prose writing. And I think those kind of individuals of a similar time to him, the circa 1000s, I want to say, they didn't see as a divide between humanities and science. It was just all these things at once. They were involved in everything, and they saw how they connected across, and how obviously also how religion overlapped across all these things, but like laws and medicine and writing and philosophy. And I think that's something that we should not aspire to necessarily replicate, but sort of have the same spirit where we look beyond the barriers we have, these artificial barriers we have. Kind of makes me think that sometimes literature is very isolated these days, where I kind of see it sort of an academic field where you have the way you look at it, especially because I'm surrounded by English students, and
I think so many people have mistaken her as being an English student. It's actually really funny at this point.
And when I hear you guys talk about your essays and everything, I feel like it's so contained in terms of what's in a book, what's in a poem. But I think my personal experience now, based in 2020, in the 2020s, is the idea that literature should go along with media. So sort of ideas of music and film, and how actually they're so similar and so piggyback on each other, that you can't just isolate and talk about these people without looking at, for example, music artists, which also draw inspiration from literature, as well as historical movements. For example, one of these people is recently Bud Bunny. I don't know how much you guys know, but he released an album last year, which is kind of, I think, an example of post-colonial history or post-colonial identity in a way. It uses Spanish, which is obviously brought by the imperializing Spaniards, but he integrates a lot of local dialect, and he kind of takes power back by using words that most people that speak Spanish wouldn't understand. But he's saying, oh, I'm from Puerto Rico, this is what we use. And I think that's such an important way. And I think the lyricism in this album is really beautiful, and he alludes to historical events. In 1948, I believe, in Puerto Rico, people are not allowed to have the Puerto Rican flag out. They were essentially killed for having it. And he says, to paraphrase in English, now I'm going to wave around my flag as much as I want, because back in the day people were killed for it. Transgresses all these lines between literature, history and media, and it's all put into this sort of a music album. But the album to me is so much more than a music album. It's almost like a story or a book in itself. It's an equivalent of that, where you have a build-up of sort of things, and he traces a colonial identity and how his identity now is rooted in what happened, but also it's more than that. He's Puerto Rican, he's not a result of Spanish and then American imperialism. And I think trying to connect literature to other ways of media is so important now, and I don't think it should be as isolated as it is, especially in the academic field. So yeah.
As you said, we need to maybe look beyond all of these and maybe integrate all of these. It is actually happening in a way where we especially look at the media, look at the movies. What are they doing? Most or maybe I think all of the movies are based on some sort of a script, right? And most of the times it's probably a novel or something on which a film is based. So the boundary between something that is written and something that is performed is is being erased in different ways and is being recreated, whether that is movies, whether that is music. I was recently going through this example of, I think that's Dominique Republic. That is probably what its name is. It is like such a short performance on YouTube, you can see it. It's just around like probably 10 minutes of performance where this main character, she starts speaking in English in different dialects, and she uses different syntax and at the same time tries to talk in different languages. And it's a very broken form of performance where you see all of these things integrating. And even there's a script for that. But it doesn't feel, you don't get much out of it. You don't understand much of it. There's like body language, there is body movements, and at the same time, these performance that is integrated in it. And it makes you think about all of these boundaries and how problematic these boundaries can be, and at the same time, how you can overlook all of these. And I am pretty sure there are so many songs as well which are being made based on different poems, different literature, because all of these things take inspiration from each other. Even the history itself, we all take inspiration from the historical events, where we think about if something has happened in a good way, we would probably maybe incorporate in our own lives. And if there is something, a historical incident, which was very problematic for people, in which, let's say, people died. So it makes you think about all of that, and then people make music out of it at times. So I think the boundaries themselves are being probably crossed and maybe redrawn at the same time.
Yeah, I feel like that's seen in the digital humanities. Just more generally, I think it's a burgeoning field in scholarship now. I never really heard about it until more recently, so it could just be me, but the idea of the digital humanities is what both of what you've said has touched upon. Something like AI is now once again creating a new boundary that needs to be redrawn, and has invited a lot of discussion in relation to the humanities. And I think that that's really interesting to see as well. And I don't think AI should be writing literature. It's not great. It's like really not. And I don't think, no matter how hard an AI model could try, it at the end of the day is a series of code. And I think the power of musicians, of artists, of writers and performers comes down to the fact that you have a human history in front of you, human lives that have actually been lived and experienced. And I don't think AI could ever sort of just chuck all of that into algorithms and reproduce that kind of element, that essential core humanity. And I think that then also returns to comparative literature and what we've been discussing so far, and that again is shared human experience that lasts the test of time and of cultural difference. But yeah, that's all from me. Does anyone have any parting words, any parting ideas they'd want to share?
I don't think so. I think everything kind of has been said.
Yeah, it was really great conversation to have and look at all of these things from different perspectives. And yeah, definitely AI is growing, but it's not going to be a human.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. I think it's where a lot of the future is headed, but I just don't think it could ever, become human. That's the one thing it can't be.
I think in a way as well, as humans, we always sought out or seek for a human connection. And when we know something is being experienced by a human or written by a human, it just clicks something in you. And when you know it's something digital or artificial, and it just makes you like, do you think it in the same way? Probably not.
Yeah, I agree. I think, I think that it can never actually reach the core of human experience ever. Yeah.
And it's humans who made AI, so.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's actually quite ironic. I guess we'll just have to wait and see where AI takes us. It's looking a bit uncertain, but yeah, I think if literature has lasted this long, it will last the test of AI and artificial intelligence, because I just don't think it could ever reach that core human experience. That would be my final statement. Thank you so much for joining me. It was a wonderful conversation, and hopefully our listeners enjoyed it too. And yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.